between transload and short-term storage. So they combined those together, and they found an overall rate of 1.43. That's, again, cars and trucks. And you compare that to the bottom number there, which is the current ITE 9th edition, and it's pretty similar to the 1.68. It's a little bit lower, but the truck rate has also gone down as an average truck rate. That's much more current data for the 0.45 there on the right versus the 0.64. But you see that if you break out these other categories, for example, cold storage, much higher overall rate and truck rate, which is very consistent with what we found. The fulfillment center and the parcel hub, we have 2 sites that we sampled, and you see very, very high rates there, but that's, statistics of small numbers. Quite honestly, that fulfillment center, Amazon, we wanted to find the peak of the peak, so we went to Amazon the week after Black Friday, Tuesday after Black Friday, just to see what happens, right? And it was actually rather amazing to look back at that video. They actually cordoned off the street. They had traffic cops there. It was like leading out of a Dodger game or something like that. It's massive traffic, and it's mostly employees though, because of Christmas season. But it just gives you an idea of the variability that you see in the data. So that when you graph this up, I'm not going to go through in detail here. This shows the trips on the vertical axes versus the square footage of the building. You see the overall rate and the truck rate in these 2 graphs. You see it's just a shotgun blast of data. It doesn't line up along a single line, and that's because you have these very variable business operations and a lot of different activities occurring within these warehouses. So they had a few recommendations that came out of it. One, I've covered already, that they combined the transload and the short-term storage, and they come up with an average rate of 0.45. Cold storage really is unique and different. It's only 9 data points, but they think it's enough to say, yeah, there's a difference there on these cold storage facilities. But there's really more study that's needed, and they recognize that this variability in business activity, trying to correlate with square foot of a building is really tough to do. It's how almost all traffic studies utilize, traffic data is based on square footage. It's a simple metric to use, but it's really tough to do for this kind of land use. The seasonal and daily variability is really high, right? And that's something that they had some recommendations on how to look at that. One idea is to perhaps do a longer term study at just a few warehouses rather than just 1 day at a time at a warehouse. I don't know if that's representative or not. Maybe pick 2 or 3 warehouses that you really know and do a year-long study. Collect data every single day for an entire year and see how that varies through time, days, weekends, month, etc. And then maybe you can sort of extrapolate from there. That's a very costly kind of study, probably on the order of about $500,000 to do that sort of thing. But they said that, and that was from this expert panel, they recommended that sort of approach. The rise of e-commerce is something that's recognized too. This industry has really been changing, and we said we started looking at this back in 2002. The industry has changed dramatically, not just one time since 2002. There's a lot of changes that have occurred on how warehousing occurs, the rise of automation, the rise of e-commerce. We're hearing that there's maybe trends to putting warehouses, there's a big trend to go to bigger buildings, that there's some benefits of doing that, but then also maybe going back into the urban core for the sort of Amazon style model of daily deliveries and that sort of thing. And so it's this multi-branching, it's a business that's evolving, right? And we are front and center when it comes to what's happening throughout the nation on this kind of industry. So the study itself, it is published as a standalone study. There's a link here at the bottom of the page. So there is a standalone study, but they do plan to incorporate this in the next edition of the Trip Generation Manual. It's currently the 9th edition. It will go to the 10th edition in theory later this year. I did mention some of the limitations of the study. It's again this average versus peak, right? And they did the best they could with the data they have and the methodology they have, but it's designed for a different purpose. And it's this variability in business type. It's really it's hard to know what do you do with that when you're making these broad generalizations and using default numbers. The data that is shown on this table, we don't need to go through any detail. What's shown here are individual CEQA documents. And looking on the table on the left, that's from the 2013 to 2014 timeframe. This is before we approached ITE. This is while we were doing our study. What's shown on the right there are the truck trip rates, and what's in brown shows what is below the ITE average from this most recent study of the 0.45. And you see a very common number there is 0.34. That was a sort of a standard method that was used at the time. It was not using the ITE 0.64 rate. It was using a combination of a Fontana truck trip study in addition to the ITE and multiplying them together. So there's sort of a standard method, but you see it was a lower truck trip rate that was used pretty commonly. The table on the right shows projects from the last 6 months, and we see that some are still using that brown color is still lower than this 0.45 number, but many are actually using higher rates, and this is using the ITE default numbers. A little bit of statistics of small numbers. There's only a few of these projects that come through. You see the square footages on some of these projects are quite large, well over 1 million square feet. I just caution that that doesn't necessarily mean that's one building. Often this will be 2 or 3 buildings to make up 1 million square feet, but 1 million plus square foot is not unheard of in our basin and for certain projects.
So Beaumont is 5 million?
That is multiple buildings for the Beaumont. That's the
0.16.
that's for the, yeah, that was multiple buildings. That was a larger development project.
No one challenged that?
That particular one, I believe there was a challenge to that. I'd have to go back and check. I know there was a challenge to one Beaumont one. We're actually involved with comments on a project in Beaumont that actually ended up getting canceled. Wasn't necessarily because of the trip rate. There's a whole variety of issues with it. I can't remember that specific project. There's the one in Beaumont I'm talking about. They're actually trying to do, I think through an addendum or an exemption. It was a very low level CEQA analysis, and that was the concern with it. I think there was people wanted to see a little bit more detail on it. So,
but using a truck rate that's 4 times lower than what they should be.
that's raises some concerns.
Yeah, with 500,000, I mean, 500 million square feet.
Yeah. That said, individual warehouses do have very low rates, and so that's the challenge. There are facilities that have very low rates, and for a variety of purposes.
Yeah, some of the larger ones do too.
Yeah, some of the very large ones that they have a very efficient operation, and maybe that's just how they operate. But one of the again part of the business model, tenants don't always own the buildings. Oftentimes there's a lease, right? They might be there for 5 years and then they leave and somebody comes in. For a CEQA analysis, you're trying to determine what's this look like off in the future. Right?
So is that trip rate, does it take into account if that truck comes in and then leaves? So
Yeah, it's
one
one-way
truck
trip.
is
It's a trip rate is based on an individual one-way trip, so in and out is 2 trips.
and we're counting that.
Yes, that's factored in, and that's standard methodology.
Yeah.
Okay. There are other efforts that are going on right now when it comes to warehousing and looking at trip rates. One in particular, Riverside County Transportation Commission, they've just kicked off their study. This is a common study that's done of sort of a nexus study of looking at what is the amount of infrastructure that is going to be needed in the future and how do you pay for that and how do you develop transportation fees for individual projects to contribute to that. So they're kicking off an update to their study. That's actually a fallout of the World Logistics Center settlement agreement between that warehouse and Riverside County. We also had our own settlement agreement, but that's separate from what they're doing. But we are participating and listening into what's happening with their traffic study. Secondly, SCAG is doing their own warehouse study. They did one back in 2008 timeframe. That's a little bit more of a market study, not necessarily trip rates, but it has some very useful information about where warehousing can grow, where it has grown, sort of what are the general market trends and growth forecasts. And they're just about finished with their study. So we're really interested to see what comes out of that. Ultimately, that could go into the regional transportation modeling as well. I do want to make a note that these trip rates that we're talking about here do not make their way into transportation modeling for the AQMP. It's a very different methodology. They do employment count based versus square footage. It's a different math altogether. CEQA math is not regional transportation modeling math, which is not real math, which is not, right?
Which isn't real.
Yes.
Welcome to government.
Yeah, there's reasons and logic behind it all, but it's just different assumptions. Lastly, the California Freight Advisory Committee, they have set an efficiency target of trying to increase the freight efficiency. And the metric that they have looked at is to increase the value of goods relative to the carbon dioxide emissions from that goods movement, and to do that by 2030. How that will sort of play out across the industries is a little unclear. It's still new information, but this could potentially play out partially when it comes to warehouse trip rates. So we're engaged in all of these activities. Next steps, it's really, I think we want to really keep working with ITE and with industry to try to, understand this issue, try to make sure that we are on top of what's happening in the industry as it changes, and it changes quite rapidly, so that we're using the best assumptions. I mean, ultimately, what we're trying to make sure is that air quality impacts are appropriately quantified and mitigated if they're significant, right? And we know that warehousing, it serves the, trucks serve the warehousing industry. Trucks are the largest source of NOx in our basin, so it's something that we definitely want to pay attention to. So we plan to continue working on this and continuing to talk to everybody involved with it. And with that, I think that's my last slide.
Thank you very much, Ian. I have a question that I would like to ask. Last time that this matter came up, there was a big controversy as to whether or not we were going to be using our own trip rates versus the ITE. And I think the board kind of gave staff some direction relative to that at that point in time. Have we come to a conclusion internally whether or not when we are doing these studies, for instance, the Merino Valley matter itself was one that was certainly very contentious as to exactly what they were going to actually pay in order to help mitigate the NOx emissions that they would be generating from that. Have we come up with something that is standard now that we won't be criticized from having our own versus something that is universally and standardly used?
Sure, it's a really good question. I'll split that up into two bits. There's the World Logistics Center settlement that had its own calculations, and as part of a settlement agreement, there was a number that was determined was appropriate to use for that settlement. That isn't necessarily something that would apply to every other warehouse. There might be some applicability, but that isn't necessarily sort of the policy setting document or something like that. It's a little bit of a standalone, but it does provide a framework and something, a reference point. When it comes to just general trip rates, what we had said back in the 2014 timeframe was, as an interim measure, we wanted to keep using the ITE rates that were available. The average rate that ITE had at the time was similar to our peak rate that we had come up with from our study, but there was certainly a lot of concerns and discussion about how we came up with a peak rate. We had said we planned to keep using that as an interim until ITE came up with something else. We do plan to keep recommending the current ITE rate that is available, which is the 0.64. We know that that's probably going to be updated later this year. We don't know for sure what that'll be. It will probably move down to 0.45. That will be an average rate as opposed to a peak rate. I think we still have concerns about this, but I don't think at this point we're ready to recommend a different approach or anything like that. I think we're still planning to use ITE for now, but we recognize this is definitely, it's an issue that we need to keep following up on.
Thank you. I would like the record to show Supervisor Ashley, I apologize. When we were getting started, I saw you were walking in, so I wanted to acknowledge your presence.
Thank you.
Since we started. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions by any of the board members to Ian concerning this matter?
I'm very encouraged by the report and the progress we're making, but sooner or later we have to get where everything's aligned. We're not using one rate for this and one rate for that. How are you going to explain that to a judge? So we got to sort of get everything conformed and going the same way here eventually. I guess we're headed that direction with these studies, but I don't know how you can use one for an EIR and then another one, for use another rate for something else. Where you got to have to conform them, or you have to be able to clearly explain why you're doing that. So I imagine that's where we're headed. I'm just I'm very, very encouraged by the depth of the report and the progress we're making. Thanks, staff, for that. Everybody that's been working on it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further comments? Is that Mrs. Kuehl?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of things. Is there any way to update our analysis when we know who the tenants are? in a given property?
When it comes to, there are some projects that we do see coming through CEQA where a tenant is known before or while the EIR is out on the street, and they might have tenant-specific rates. It's the rare case, and that's fine. If there's tenant-specific
But
data, that's the
once
best.
that's
But once
done,
it's
we're kind of-
done,
We're stuck with our analysis, we did an average or something, and then, Amazon moves in and it's a lot more than we thought.
sure, that, the World Logistics Center is a little bit different in that one still doesn't have tenants that are identified. It's a 40 building plus development, and it's not clear who the tenants might be. So I don't know that we have any adjustments that are built into there. Typically, when it comes to CEQA, once the EIR is approved, usually that's it. There are some provisions that potentially you could reopen a CEQA document if there's substantial new information that comes forward that is relevant and you think is worth bringing it back out into CEQA. There are ways to do that, but that's not the typical practice.
And my other question is, are there additional ways that we can use this information for our particular purposes?
Sure. We are obviously engaged in a variety of efforts when it comes to mobile sources. One of the things we're doing is this facility-based measures, and there is the warehouse group as part of that. This is one of many, many things that we have to consider when it comes to that working group, and so that's it's just one other data point that we're considering. It kind of gets to the overall, how do warehouses operate? What are ways to improve the air quality associated with warehouses? So it's an extra data point there that can be applied.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Go right ahead, Supervisor Ashley.
I spent a lot of time with the large water district, and we had this problem when you're having like a restaurant or something that uses a lot of water, and then it goes into your sewer system, and you're taking a study, and you're using a study to start out. But we go a year, and then we'd adjust to actual, whatever the actual amount of water usage was. That's what they're charged for going forward. We adjusted. Is there any way that you charge them a set fee, and then after they get a tenant, within a year they come in and they do either adjust to what the actual traffic is after a year, or to the studies that we've developed for that particular usage, whether it be cold storage or short-term storage or whatever, a full fulfillment center, whatever it is. There's some way we could adjust to actual out there. I think that's what Sheila was pointing to. She was concerned about that.
CEQA mitigation requirements that were dependent on actual.
Yeah.
Sure. So I think on a fee-based, first, just to touch on that, we don't have any fees here at the Air District, obviously, associated with warehouses and how they operate. There are the transportation fees, there are development impact fees, there are a whole variety of fees associated with warehousing, and it varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Yeah.
But for those particular fee programs, in that case, averages might make a little bit more sense because they're worried about systematic or system-wide transportation improvements, and you're looking at the entire industry, that an average might actually make sense, that it's all going to play out in the end.
It's all going to come out the same in the end. Okay.
Yeah, but for air quality, it might be a little different, where you might have some localized impacts that you're concerned about. You are worried about the peak rates. So air quality might be a little bit different in that instance. We haven't seen any programs so far that have that sort of look back for warehousing projects. You do get it every now and again on other projects. I think down at the port, we've seen some conditions that there is supposed to be a look back and then to adjust mitigation appropriately if there are changes in some assumptions, but that's pretty rare that happens.
Okay, thank you.
Is that something we would, you can do that under the current CEQA guidelines and the Public Resources Code. You don't have to do a legislative change.
No, that could happen.
Yes, Ms. Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of questions, because you touched on this briefly, that how this information might be used in the future for indirect source rule, facility-based measures. And first of all, can we quantify the pollution impacts from this kind of information? And if not, from what information would we be able to calculate that?
We would, yeah, this is actually really useful information for quantifying impacts. This is sort of the primary way to do it when it comes to a CEQA analysis. Again, when you do regional modeling, it's a little bit different. They each have their pluses and minuses in their approaches, but this is certainly really important when it comes to quantifying impacts.
And then when I just spent 2 days at a freight movement conference, which our agency helped sponsor. Thank you, agency. It was a very good conference. And so the whole point of those discussions, and we had a lot of people there at Amazon, UPS, Volvo was there, FedEx, so private people as well as government people, Brian Kelly and Matt Rodriguez. So there was a lot of discussion about how we move freight, and a lot of that emphasis was on efficiency, moving it more efficiently. And one of the troubling things I think about the whole warehousing industry is that warehouses are being built in the Inland Empire because land is cheap there. So the goods may go all the way out there and be transloaded or reconfigured, and then they come back into the basin. So this is something I think we need to be cognizant of and think about as we develop policies on this. And the way freight moves is so complex. It's very, as you can see just from these warehousing, different kinds of warehousing, that the way it actually gets moved around is not always the same depending on what the point is, whether it's transloading or whether it's a custodial kind of operation like FedEx and UPS has. So we don't want to be involved in local land use, but I would think that we could develop guidance as we think about these kinds of things. Because we have on our board a number of people that represent local government. Also, I'm wondering whether, I assume that we're sharing this kind of information with California Air Resources Board.
Yeah, we were involved with them earlier on, although they sort of pay attention to this sort of thing, but it's not really what they get to engage with.
Well, one thing that the board has been asked to do, or what the board, the California Air Resources Agency has been asked to do by our board, is to study indirect source rule and how that plays into air quality issues. That's why I bring this up, because I think it would be useful for this kind of information to be shared with them, let them know we've done these kinds of studies.
Specifically warehouses by March of next year to come back with concepts and analysis.
Right, so we expect March or April for them to come back, with their initial study. It's just an initial study too. It's that board asked for guidance as this issue has raised its tentacles as the ISR issue comes up. And some of the people at the conference over the last 2 days, some of the warehousing people the trucking people are very concerned about an ISR rule. So we need to think about, how that works and how it impacts, the industry. And you have been working very extensively, Joe, with the City of LA and the Port of LA.
Yes, far too extensively.
Freight movement. And so, Peter Payton was at this meeting, and Peter is very knowledgeable
Understands the system.
on freight movement in the systems. And one of the things that he talked about extensively was this efficiency, the efficiency issue. There's a lot of inefficiencies in freight movement from the port area where the trucks are idling for a long time or waiting to get a load at a gate, et cetera. So those are things I think that are really important in reducing pollution, because as trucks sit around and idle, they're just polluting air for no purpose. They're not even moving anything, they're just sitting around. So anyway, the freight movement is a big issue for us, and I think this study is very useful in working out some of the kinks that we need to work out. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilman, if I could just provide some information. So as we're working on our indirect source rules, CARB is actually present at each of our working group meetings. We're working to get them on the table with us, but at least they're in the room and we're in discussions. And so they're constantly kept apprised of all of this information that we're gathering and how we're moving forward. The big challenge that we hear from industry, particularly on these ISRs, well, what's CARB doing? What are you guys doing? And what we want to make sure is that there's no daylight between us. That
Exactly.
there's that understanding of how we're moving forward, the information that we're collecting, and how CARB will utilize that information. So the goal is to have that unified front and not have differences between what we're recommending and then CARB having a different idea. So we're working very diligently with CARB to make sure that happens, and I would say that's going fairly well. The efficiency is something that was also raised recently when we were at the SEED conference earlier this week. And it was raised in a way by the railroads that I thought just really exemplified the challenge. And it was when it was sort of characterized, it's very complicated. How do I explain this? And I think about how I explain it to my family, and the railroad said, so I explained it like this. I need to go to the store and buy mayonnaise. But I get to the store and there's no mayonnaise. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go to another store until I get the mayonnaise so that I can make my chicken salad. And I thought as this was being described, I always think about your own family. And my son would have said, why are you going to the store? You could have just tapped the button. It would have been delivered in a zero-emission bus or vehicle. And so the whole concept about efficiency is one that Amazon's blown up logistics, right? And so how do we get that kind of efficiency? How do we get that logistics organization to really occur? And so Matt was explaining to me that there's a company that's actually involved in some of the logistics data collection and is actually trying to increase the efficiency that way. And so the efficiency, I think, is one of the big issues that the data collection and dissemination and the use is really going to be on the cutting edge. And
the guy who's doing this is a guy who is a sort of a venture capitalist who has been involved in a lot of different industries, including the airline industry when it was falling apart at the seams, and he was brought into United to bring them out of bankruptcy. And the thing he learned was the value of big data and how the airlines use big data to. They're basically doing logistics too. It's just they're moving around these bodies instead of these giant containers. And he said that they use more computing time and memory than anyone in the whole world. And they know if someone misses a flight in Japan, how it's going to impact the next morning's flights in Amsterdam. He says that the information that the airlines have is unbelievable in terms of this. And what he sees as a business opportunity at the ports and through the logistics system is that no one's been doing this.
Yeah.
And so he's trying to use big data in order to apply it in a way to actually make a ton of money, but it will also increase dramatically, potentially, the efficiency of how things are moved.
Well, I've asked Matt to look into that and see if there's some way that we can participate in that, whether it's financially, whether it's through some means. We want to be able to understand.
I think
what
there
he's
is
doing.
opportunity. You haven't met Jonathan?
I'm going to meet him, I think, this coming week.
Okay.
So one of the people at the conference was a gentleman from GE Digital, and he's working with Gene Soroka.
Yes. And
Doing something very similar to that. Where does each package go, and how and why, and
yeah,
we
and
do it better?
there's been some mention of that at the SEED conference too, where in anticipation.
Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, because of the time constraints, I would like to, I've been admonished that we usually run over, so I want to make sure that we get through this, and I think we're having a discussion that we can continue on.
Mr. Chairman,
But, we have the.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that this is the one substantive item on the agenda, and stationary source isn't scheduled to start till 10:30.
Or is it 10?
Oh, okay.
I just checked the agenda, it says 10:30.
Yeah, it was 10 last time.
I was intending to talk about all of my issues today.
10:30, huh?
That's right, Ian, take a deep breath.
That's just the
Yes.
goal, right?
But on
Let
this.
me ask that question, and if we can go back and, are there any questions on any of the written reports that we have by any of the board members? If none there, we will basically,
Well, yes, and I haven't.
Chair, we have a public comment.
And before we move on,
Okay,
I
go right
really
ahead.
would like to be able to ask my questions and make a couple of points, if that would be possible.
it would be, what I would like to do, because of the order itself of a prior hospital commitment that I have at a little later, is to let you then continue to chair the meeting while I excuse myself
Oh.
and go forward with the balance and stuff of the agenda. Would you mind, Dr. Lou?
Not at all, Dr. Parker. I hope everything's okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, go right ahead, and I'll see you guys in September.
Okay.
Thanks, Dr. Parker.
Have a great August.
All right, bye-bye.
So we were talking about the GE, and
Digital, yeah.
what they did is anticipation of these very large ships coming in, as they started working with GE to try to figure out how to know what's on the ship and where, and how to most efficiently offload it and move those containers, which it worked out really, really well for them. And one of the things that the industry was talking about is, of course, they have a lot of confidential business information, and so GE is like this third party that they can trust to handle that data without blowing the confidential business information out of the water there. I had a question, I think it was a little similar to Judy's, about the impacts in terms of NOx emissions. If you say there's 1 billion square feet of warehouses in the region, and 90% of the NOx emission comes from the trucks, do we know how much that is?
I don't think we've actually gone through that math, and I think using these trip rates is probably not appropriate for that exercise necessarily. It might be, but I think we'd want to work with SCAG to think about.
Yeah, I know you
regionally.
have to use the MFAC or something in terms of emissions factors, but
Yeah, I mean, you can see the scatter from warehouse to warehouse. And so I think there's other ways to get a regional transportation truck VMT.
Right.
It's different from analyzing an individual warehouse project. That might even be more accurate in aggregate.
But
So-
to me, if we're talking about 1 billion square feet and 15 to 20 million being added every year, before I criticize everybody on their warehouses, I want to make sure that those NOx emissions are actually as significant as I think they are. So it would be good to have some kind of analysis on what the emissions associated with the truck trips to and from the warehouses would be.
In aggregate, all in the warehouse.
Yes, yeah, and just to get some perspective on that. The fulfillment centers and parcel hubs, we only looked at one each. Do they make up a really small proportion?
Yes.
Really?
Well, fulfillment centers in particular are growing.
Uh-huh.
And I think one of the things we've also seen is that you might have a dedicated building like an Amazon building that is a fulfillment center, but e-commerce is being served out of many warehouses. So they might convert a piece of their building to e-commerce. And the operations there might be a little different than the cross dock they have, which might be different from the short-term storage. They might have cold storage at the same time.
Right.
So that model is also out there.
And the parcel hubs, I would imagine that they would actually be more willing to work with us, and they probably have pretty good data.
Yeah, I think we've worked, or we've, seen that, some of the projects we have on different sort of alternative fuels on trucking, that some of these, carriers have been willing to work with us on that.
And they're willing to share their data. They said that at the meeting the last 2 days. UPS and FedEx are willing to share their data on this kind of thing.
Great.
It would be good, just to interrupt for a moment. I mean, I would be interested in doing a tour of some of the warehouses to see how they operate. I don't know, maybe others would like to do that. It would be, I think, instructive for us to actually see. I have visited transloading facilities before, but something like the Amazon facility would be interesting.
Yeah, I haven't been to those either.
Yeah,
So I would like to join if we do that. I don't know if you noticed this, but on slide 7, you said there was 107 facilities analyzed, and then you gave the numbers on slide 8, and they only added up to 102.
You would look at that.
Slide
Did you
8.
lose 5 warehouses somewhere?
That was old math.
Yeah, I'll blame it on the math. Let's see here.
It was 91, 9, 1, and 1, which is 102 on slide 8.
I'd have to go back and check.
Okay.
They're all there in the
Just
study.
want to make sure you didn't lose any warehouses.
They're all there in the study.
And the peak daily rates issue certainly suggests that, I mean, if that's the one that's useful to us, I would have hoped that some of our $50,000 would have gone to creating numbers that we could actually use. I mean, I know this average daily and the peak AM, PM are important, but for air quality, we really need to get out and do that. I think this was a really good use of investment for us. So if it's going to cost more money to go out and get the number that we need for the peak daily rates, let's go out and do that, right? I mean, that's important for us, and make sure, especially given all the variability we've observed, we want to make sure that we have a good number there, and if we have to do research to get that number, let's go out and do it. One thing you might not be aware of that potentially could be helpful, although it's not this district, Air Resources Board, Cynthia Marvin is engaged in a survey of warehouses in the Central Valley, where they're actually having interns take a look at Google Maps and saying, oh, that looks like a warehouse, and zooming in and trying to figure that out. The only way they could figure out how to do it. And they're in the middle of it right now, and still collecting and analyzing the data, but it could be helpful for what we're doing. And let's see, what's peak daily rates, the scatter plot, it looked like on the lower right-hand side, there were some very large warehouses that didn't have a whole lot of trips associated with them. And then there were some smaller ones that had some high ones. I mean, when I see something that doesn't logically make sense like that, to me, it kind of calls out for more data analysis. And if there's a way to do some qualitative assessment as to what the difference is in those kind of quadrants within that scatter plot, maybe we can get some understanding of the variables we're missing, and we can have a better understanding of the relationship there.
We actually, the study actually, I didn't cover it in this slide, but the study goes into more detail and looks at trying to segregate 500,000 and above, 800,000 and above, that sort of thing, and trying to see are there correlations that make sense.
Yeah.
Not a whole lot. In general, you would say the largest buildings in general have lower trip rates. They tend to be the newest as well, and so you tend to have a lot more automation in those buildings. One of the things we've seen with these larger buildings is that they might consolidate several small 200,000, 300,000 square foot warehouses into a single building. Now the trips that were going between the smaller warehouses are all happening with conveyance systems inside the building, right? So you can reduce some trip rates that way, but that doesn't always happen, right? I mean, it depends on the business.
Yeah, and the trends over time are going to be interesting too, because there's going to be more and more of that happening.
Right.
And if it's fewer truck rates, we should actually acknowledge that.
Right.
I was curious as to the county of Riverside, I think it is, it's considering logistics fee.
It's their transportation fee. They already have one, actually.
have
So
one.
WRCOG manages the dump fee, transportation. and
Okay, so it's
propagation fee.
WRCOG, who's the San Bernardino doing one?
Sandbag has a different approach to it. They have a similar kind of nexus study that was done, but it's a different approach. I think it puts it back on the individual jurisdictions to do it. And I don't know.
Is that how that's?
Yeah, they have a nexus study which says each intersection, we share, each jurisdiction shares part of the impact of development. And then those jurisdictions charge those fees onto the development, and then when they get ready to improve that intersection, they all pony up their money.
Overall, is this happening between Riverside and San Bernardino in a way that keeps the incentives kind of even, so that we can't expect?
Yeah, it's about the same.
Yeah, more development in one region than another. Okay, that's something I hadn't knew about before, so it's very interesting. Well, thanks. That does wrap all mine up. You're right. I think you wanted to come ask a question or make a comment?
Which item? This item.
On the study, right?
Let's go.
On the study, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, not on the other two.
Okay.
I don't know. And I'll be brief so you'll get out of here by 10:30. Okay,
Your 3 minutes
okay?
starts now, yes.
I'm sorry about Dr. Parker, but he had another commitment apparently. Anyway, my name is Peter Herzog and I'm with NAP, and I just wanted to come up very briefly because obviously we were mentioned. And quite frankly, we enjoyed very much this partnership that occurred on this particular issue. As Ian outlined, it included both manpower, person power, because there's a lot of people involved, and financial. And quite frankly, this kind of a concept of doing something like this on a voluntary basis, where you look at an issue in detail, and here we even included a third party, obviously, who actually wrote the report. Neither of us or our organizations wrote the report, so it was written by somebody else who were obviously involved. Sure. But as far as the actual writing, it was not. So quite frankly, this concept of sort of this third-party partnership idea, to me, is more of a model that can be used on a lot of complicated issues. And I think it's one that should look at seriously. And again, the third party wrote the report. And so I think that was even more telling as far as how we can look at things in more detail. And obviously, in the course of the discussion, this whole goods movement, freights movement, whatever terminology you want to use, is extremely complex. There are no easy answers to either increasing efficiency or whatever you want to bring up. It's a very complex thing, and California just has to be subject to being geographically in a location, so to speak, with the ports and everything, that freight is going to be coming and going. And plus, we have 17 million people here who seem to like to buy stuff, whether it's going to be e-commerce or what, but apparently they like to buy things. So that there is going to be commerce and goods movement as long as the people hang around. I'm not expecting them to leave, so obviously that's an entirely another issue. And I think it's important, what the report really did and its purpose was to initially look at how can we look at trip generation. And this was really a phase one concept. And through the discussions, that is how it was phrased. Because that was always the question. And so what this report came out with was there was no conclusions or specific recommendations. It was an evaluation of how can we move forward to look at how you do trip generations. And we've been talking about that for a while, as Ian outlined, and I think that conversation can continue. But again, it's important, there were no conclusions made, there were no new categories created, no new trip rates were created, a lot of discussion. And that discussion basically came out with the main, really sole recommendation was that we need to keep working on it. And so I think everybody's in agreement with that. So this is an occasion where I think, now we even had a third party, we were in agreement as to both how we proceeded on this project and actually the recommendation, which is to continue the work. And so to me, everything, you look at the entire package, again, this is a very good model on how to proceed on very difficult issues. ISRs were referenced in the discussion. That's obviously a very serious issue. And quite frankly, I think this kind of model is a better way to approach that than just a top-down kind of approach. And because, we've made our positions known very well. There's no mystery about how people feel about that. And we would prefer to really focus on what we're doing here on trying to actually go at the issue and also work on technology than some of these other side issues that are actually going to distract from getting to really the main point. And so, again, we look forward to continuing to work, and hopefully we can stay focused on that and not some of this other stuff. Happy to answer your
Let me
questions.
just comment that at the conference over the last 2 days, one of the things that was brought up was to bring in a third party to help when you have really complex problems like this. And so obviously that model has worked well here, and it's something we can think about as we continue to work on these problems.
Thank you.
Okay. See?
Anyone?
I didn't hold up tensor.
I think we're still going to make it. Anyone else? Any other questions or comments? No one in the remote location or locations? 2 empty chairs and a supervisor. Thank you, Ian. We'll then I think we just receive and file the written reports on items 2 and 3, right? Or do we have a staff presentation on?
The presentations, just see.
Okay. Receive and file 2 and 3 without objection. Any other business from anyone? I would note that, and I can't remember when the comment period closes, but the Clean Air Action Plan from the San Pedro Bay Ports came out a couple days ago. It would be something that this committee might want to consider, but I'm not sure that the timing is right for us. But yeah, I guess September maybe. So if you could talk to the chair,
But we're also considering whether the Ports Committee.
oh,
The
we're
Ports
actually
Committee
convening the
might
Ports
do
Committee?
Yeah.
I'm on that too, so yeah, that'd be fine too.
Comments are due September 18th.
It's September 18th and decision in November still, right? Okay.
September, is that the last day for comments?
Yes.
September 18th.
I don't know if that is before or after the next mobile source.
It's a little bit after, but
September 15th is your next meeting date,
Oh.
but that's very, very.
Yeah.
It's very, very close.
but we're
We can
looking
wait
at
that
a
long.
Ports Committee meeting
Yeah, they
sometime
can-
before that.
Uh-huh.
That would be good.
Okay, great. That's the only other business item I think there was. And then public comment, any public comments? All right, hearing none, I will adjourn and I do see here that we are going to meet again on September 15th, 9 a.m. here in CC8. Thank you very much. What do we do for the next half hour?
Would you guys like an
Go
update on some of the
outside.
legislative activity?
Oh, sure.
There's been a lot of action this
A lot of
past
stuff
week.
happened.
Give him a